Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm Phil. This is my attempt to examine my life well and encourage you to examine yours well as well. And so this week I'm going to be going in and talking about how we can use some of the thought experiments philosophers have talked about to help us better understand what we should think and do about the coronavirus. As I'm sure is the case for many of you, I've kind of been stuck more or less at or around the house with my two kids this week, which has made it exceptionally difficult to get a podcast done because a 3-year-old and a 1.5-year-old are exceptionally loud and require almost constant attention. Right now, the 1.5-year-old is taking a nap, cross your fingers, and my 3-year-old daughter is playing outside right by the door, so you might actually hear her and or the dog in the background periodically while this is going on. And who knows, I may have to stop part of the way through and pick it up again, so you may hear the sound levels change. We're all doing what we need to do to get by, and I guess when you're in the middle of a pandemic where there are actually people really suffering and dying, if the worst thing I have to deal with is some inconvenience in doing the podcast, I'm not doing that badly, I guess. So those two problems or thought experiments are Pascal's wager and the trolley problem. Pascal's wager was obviously proposed by Blaise Pascal, it's in his name, and the trolley problem was first proposed by Philip Foot, I think about 50, 60 years ago now. And the point of Pascal's wager and trolley problem here is that if you've actually kind of worked your way through them before, thought about them, studied them, looked at different proposed solutions and objections, it's going to have trained your mind to think about these kind of issues rationally. It's going to have helped train your mind to think about ethical situations rationally. It's going to help train your mind to think about ethical conflict rationally. And same thing with risk-reward. It's going to have trained your mind to help try to balance risk and reward in a bit more of a rational sense, because Pascal's wager is all about how you balance risk-reward, and the trolley problem is all about how you deal with ethical dilemmas, ethical problems. And I know if you dig deep into literature on this, you'll find some people who disagree with me that the point of Pascal's wager is risk-reward, but that's how I think is the most sensible way to see it, and that's how I'm going to present it here anyway. So I'm just going to go through these. These two thought experiments, these two ways of looking at things, Pascal's wager and the trolley problem, explain what they are and explain how they actually do apply very, very well to the situation the world and many of us find ourselves in right now. Because I'm sure, since I assume most of the people who listen to me are here in the States like I am, you're either being self-quarantined or in situations where a lot of businesses around you are being closed down and you're being encouraged to do social and self-isolation just like myself and my family is. And in my family's case, my wife actually is a physician who's still going to work and treating patients right now. So her and I have talked about it, and we've thought because of her job, there's actually a much greater chance that myself and the rest of the people in our family are going to be exposed to the virus because there's a greater chance she's going to be exposed. So we think that there's there is a greater moral imperative on me and my children and my wife to isolate ourselves than there is on many other people, because there's a greater chance we'd spread it around. And there you can hear my dog barking outside because, again, I got to do this when I can do it right now. Now, as I hope should be immediately obvious or just prima facie apparent to you, part of what you need to think about and what you want to deal with when you're looking at situations like a global pandemic is the risk factor, risk versus reward. And really we're all kind of thinking about this all the time. It's just we're usually very, very bad at it. Most of us human beings think we're very, very good at assessing risk, but the reality is most of us are actually very, very bad at properly assessing risk. So, good example, using myself. I've taken a couple of vacations with my wife where we've gone to a place where there's like a beach and an ocean. And my wife really likes going in the water and swimming there. And she's done snorkeling. I've done that once with her. And she'd done it once or twice before her and I even met each other. But I don't particularly enjoy that. And part of the reason I don't enjoy that is I've seen too many shark attack movies. Okay, so as I'd said, my daughter interrupted me. She was complaining that it was too cold outside and she wanted to come back inside. So sorry about that, but hey, we're all doing what we can do. And as I said before, if that's the worst thing I'm dealing with this week, given what else is going on in the world, not that bad off. So anyhow, as I was saying, I don't really enjoy swimming in the ocean because I've seen so many shark attack movies and other monster movies where like a giant squid attacks somebody in the sea or something like that, because I enjoy those types of movies. I find the concept just kind of cool, even though it's not particularly rational, but I enjoy them. So I've seen a lot of those. So every time I get into water in the ocean, especially if it's a little bit deeper, that's where immediately where my mind goes is, when's the great white gonna come and snatch me out of the water and bite me and kill me and things along those lines. Even though I know, rationally speaking, the odds of me being a victim of a shark attack if I'm swimming in the water in an area where there aren't really sharks around, especially on a crowded beach, extremely, extremely low. It's very, very unlikely. Statistically speaking, there's probably less than a 1% chance of that happening. In fact, it might even be lower than that. And my rational mind knows that. But the part of my brain that isn't quite so rational can never quite get that out of my head. So I'll still go do it, but I don't really enjoy it, and that's probably part of the reason why. And that's not just me. After the movie Jaws came out, I think it was well recorded that people's fear of sharks went up considerably, and there were less people who took vacations to the beach for that reason, although I could be a little off on that. Or conversely, example that I know some people who are a little bit more libertarian in their politics like to bring up all the time is terrorism, terrorism is a really big problem where look what happened on 9/11. It's not a small thing. But statistically speaking also, your odds of being killed by a terrorist, even if you take into account 9/11, are much, much lower than your odds of dying in a car crash or a plane crash. But you probably still drive your car and you probably still get on planes, and you're probably a whole lot less scared of that than you are of the idea of a Muslim terrorist trying to shoot up a place or blow up a place. And part of that problem with this is that our minds are kind of trained in such a way where if it's a risk that we look at that's kind of normal, we don't really assess it properly. We don't really assess the risk of, say, kids playing by a pond or jumping on a trampoline or driving in a car or flying or something like that properly, because those are normal, where a novel risk, something that seems exciting or unusual, like the shark attack, like terrorism, so on and so forth, our minds tend to play those up. And there could be a whole host of reasons for that. I've heard some people speculate that has to do with evolutionary theory, the idea being that when our species was developing, novel risks were much more serious than normal risks, because normal risks just weren't really very much risks then. So a risk that it seems novel and unusual was something we're just kind of were trained or bred to take more seriously. And so naturally we're not very good at assessing, well, am I more likely to die of a shark attack or not? Or am I more likely to die in a car crash than in a terrorist attack? And I don't know if that is exactly the answer to that, because that depends on where you fall on evolutionary theory. But at the same time, it does seem to be true, practically speaking, in the real world, that most of us are just really, really bad at assessing risk. But at the same time, we all tend to think that we're really, really good at it. If we were all really, really good at assessing risk, no casino in the world would actually make money, because the odds of you winning at a casino are exceptionally, exceptionally low. But people still go there and still lose money instead of making it. And again, using myself for an example, it was about, I think, a year or two ago when one of the lotteries was over like $1 billion. I think it was the Mega Millions one. I don't remember exactly. Well, anyhow, lots of people went out and bought tickets just because it was over $1 billion, because the potential reward was so high. I even did that. I talked to my wife about it and said, hey, we could throw $20 at this. I mean, we can afford to throw away $20 on the slim, slim, slim chance that we might walk away with $1 billion. Because in our minds, what it looked like was the reward is so high that it outweighed the fact that the odds of us winning were virtually nil, Not zero, but just about zero. And point of fact, if we were being rational about it, what we would do is not look for a lottery that has the highest payout, because when it has the highest payout, everybody does like what I did. They go buy a ticket because, hey, $20 versus $1 billion? Of course I'll throw $20 away on a small chance for $1 billion. But the rational thing to do would actually be the opposite, which would be to buy tickets when the payout is very, very small, because then there's less people buying tickets and you're far more likely to win. Well, I think not far more likely, because your odds of winning the lottery are always very, very bad. But your odds are going to be better with a small payout than a large payout, because less people buy tickets. So, just another example of how lots of people, including me, are not as good at assessing risk versus reward as we think we are. Now, at least in my case, this might sound, I hope this doesn't come across as too arrogant, but at least in my case, I'm able to look back and say, yeah, I'm not being rational when I behave in these ways. Yeah, that's not a rational way to look at it. And no, I can't always quite help myself as much as I would like to. I did still go waste $20 on the infinitesimally small chance I would get $1 billion. But at least I'm able to look back and say, yeah, that was dumb. I shouldn't have done that. It didn't really hurt me, and didn't seem to hurt anything. It wasn't like the worst thing ever, but it was dumb. And same thing with my fear of getting bitten or killed by a shark. Well, we're swimming in the ocean at a relatively calm beach that's crowded with people in the middle of the day. Odds of a shark attack on anybody, much less me, then infinitesimally low, yet it still bothers me. Now, as I'd said before, Pascal's wager is really all about assessing risk versus reward, i.e., is the risk that you're going to be wrong about belief in God and end up with some type of eternal damnation, how's that contrasted with the potential reward of you being right about belief in God and spending an eternity in blissful happiness with your Creator? And it's all about assessing those two and comparing and contrasting and figuring out, well, what should I do? And so the original wager comes from Blaise Pascal, who lived from 1623 to 1622. It was published in his Pensies. You can go... I'm probably mispronouncing that, because as everyone here knows, I'm terrible at pronouncing anything. So his original wager, I'll just read you some of the text from the passages, and hopefully you can follow along. Pascal says, "If there is a God, he is infinitely incomprehensible, since having neither parts nor limits, he has no affinity to us. We are then incapable of knowing either what he is or if he is. God is or he is not. But which side shall we incline? Reason can decide nothing here. There is an infinite chaos which separated us. A game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance, where heads or tails will turn up. What will you wager? According to reason, you can do neither the one thing nor the other. According to reason, you can defend neither of these propositions. Do not, then, reprove for error those who have made it a choice, for you know nothing about it. No, but I blame them for having made not this choice, but a choice. For again, both he who chooses heads and he who chooses tails are equally at fault. They are both in the wrong. The true course is not to wager at all." So, again, and philosophers, especially ancient ones, tend to write in ways that are a little difficult to follow. What Pascal is claiming here is you can't use your reason to determine whether or not God exists. So you're then left with two options. Either God does exist or he does not. But since you can't use your reason to decide, the people who, and you kind of have to decide, you have to go with one or the other. This predates claims of agnosticism that claim it's okay not to decide, so Pascal was kind of assuming you have to decide. Well, if you have to decide, it has to be one or the other. So how are you going to decide? And what he's saying is both that you shouldn't blame people who've made a choice, because they have to make a choice, and the people who have made a choice are, in a certain sense, kind of blameworthy, because there's no good reason for them to make that choice. And so he goes on to say, "Yes, but you must wager. It is not optional. You are embarked. Which will you choose then? Let us see. Since you must choose, let us see which interests you least. You have two things to lose, the true and the good, and two things at stake, your reason and your will, your knowledge and your happiness. And your nature has two things to shun, error and misery. Your reason is no more shocked in choosing one rather than the other, since you must of necessity choose. This is one point settled. But your happiness? Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering what God is. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitation, that he is. That is very fine. Yes, I must wager, but I may perhaps wager too much. Let us see. Since there is an equal risk of gain and of loss, if you had only to gain 2 lives instead of 1, you might still wager. But if there were 3 lives to gain, you would have to play. Since you are under the necessity of playing, you would be imprudent when you were forced to play, not to chance your life to gain 3 at a game where there is equal risk of loss and gain, but there is an eternity of life and happiness. And this being so, if there were an infinity of chances, of which one only would be for you, you would still be right in wagering 1 to win 2. You would act stupidly, being obliged to play, by refusing to stake 1 life against 3 at a game out of which an infinity of chances there is 1 for you. If there were an infinity of an infinitely happy life to gain. But there is here an infinity of an infinitely happy life to gain, a chance to gain against a finite number of chances of loss, and what you stake is finite. Okay, I'm sure the last paragraph there was rather difficult for many people to follow. It's difficult for me to follow. But what Pascal is saying here is essentially, you have to make a choice. And that's one of the assumptions he bakes into this, is you have to make a choice. As he says, you're embarked. You're on a ship sailing to the destination. You can't jump off the ship. You can't turn back. You have to make a choice. Where are you going to go? God exists or he doesn't. Now, some contemporary philosophers will dispute this and say agnosticism is a fine position, but I disagree in the sense that agnosticism is essentially, by trying to choose not to choose, you are choosing, and you're choosing against God. You can't really hedge your bets that way, at least not indefinitely. Maybe you could do it for a brief period of time, which is something I'll discuss a little bit later, but you can't do it indefinitely all your life. It's not like if you die and go to heaven, or go to the judgment, and God says, well, hey, you didn't believe in me. You can say to him, no, I never chose not to believe in you. I just didn't choose to believe in you. And that's obviously not going to work out so well, at least not according to pretty much any religious text that I'm aware of. The other assumption Pascal is making here right from the get-go, and this one I actually do fundamentally disagree with, is he's saying your reason can't decide this for you. Arguments and evidence for the existence of God, it either doesn't work or it's on balance comparable with arguments and evidence against the existence of God. So you can't use your reason and evidence to figure this out. You can't treat it like a detective would a murder case. You can't treat it like I have used inference to the best explanation before to say that demonstrates Christ rose from the dead. He assumes right from the get-go that that doesn't work. Now, there's a whole host of reasons for that. Pascal was a Christian theist, so he obviously did think that Christ rose from the dead, but he just assumes right from the get-go, your reason's not going to decide this for you. And so in balancing risk versus reward, what this kind of shows us right from the get-go here is, the only way it makes rational sense to balance risk versus reward is if the evidence in favor of one or the other is more or less on balance, kind of iffy, in flux, to the point where the evidence, reasons, and arguments isn't really going to show you which one is better than the other. And that's why the lottery and casinos are such a great example, because there we absolutely know the evidence, reasons, and arguments show you, no, you absolutely should not waste your money at the roulette table or on the lottery. The odds of you winning are so infinitesimally low. It's just not going to work. Now, if you're a really, really good card player, you can count cards very well, you might do all right at blackjack, or you might be able to do all right at poker, because there is some skill involved in those kind of games. But you got to be really, really good at it in order to make that work. A lot better than I am, even though I've enjoyed playing poker. I'm never going to win any money at it because I'm just not good enough to do that. So there's a clear example where the evidence clearly indicates the risk heavily, heavily outweighs the reward. And the way the casinos and people who run the lottery get you to buy into it anyway is they up the appearance of the reward. That is, the amount you might get is so high that in your mind it outweighs the risk, even though there's virtually no chance you're ever going to get the reward. There's virtually no chance you're ever going to get the $1 billion from the lottery. And so going back to Pascal, what he's arguing there is, okay, you have two options. Believe in God, don't believe in him. And furthermore, in each of those cases, there's a way you can be wrong and there's a way you can be right, obviously. If you believe in God, it could be that you're right and he does exist, and it could be that you're wrong and he doesn't exist. If you don't believe in God, it could be that you're wrong and he does exist, and it could be that you're right and he doesn't exist. And so what you need to weigh there is risk versus reward. What do you have to gain by believing in God versus what do you have to lose by not believing in him, and what's the worst case scenario on each one? Well, if you don't believe in God and you're right, you don't really gain anything. You don't really lose anything either. I mean, you might gain some kind of a smug satisfaction that you're right about the whole thing, as some atheists on the internet claim they have. But at the end of your life, when you die, have you really gained anything? Nah, not really. And to be fair, you probably haven't really lost much of anything either. The only thing that you really get is, hey, I was right. Now, if you're wrong, though, you really, really, really lose something. What you lose is the chance to be with a loving God for all eternity who loves you and wants to spend all of eternity with you and wants to make you a better person. You lose the heavenly bliss, or I think what Aquinas called the beatific vision. You never get that. And that is something that's a big loss. That's not a small thing. That's, according to Aquinas and many other philosophers, the thing that all human beings should be striving to get for. And you can find echoes of that even in pre-Christian philosophers where they're saying we need to seek the good. Aquinas would, I think, equate the beatific vision with the good with a capital G. So if you don't believe in God and you're wrong, you've really, really, really lost out. So that's something to consider. Now, if you do believe in God and you're right, well, hey, you get exactly that. You get the beatific vision. You get the good with a capital G. You get to spend all eternity with a loving creator who wants to be with you. That's a great, great thing. What if you believe in God and you're wrong? God doesn't exist. Well, it turns out you were wrong, so you miss the satisfaction of being right, although you almost certainly would never know that if everything ends when you die. And you may, depending on how you want to live your life, miss out on some various pleasures that God and the scriptures say you shouldn't partake in. And so that's something, but not really that much in comparison to the idea of the beatific vision or being in commune with the creator of the universe and the good with a capital G. And so what Pascal's saying you need to do here is you need to compare what happens if you're wrong in both circumstances. If you don't believe in God and you're wrong, you've lost the greatest possible thing that any human being could get. If you do believe in God and you're wrong, well, you've lost out on some pleasures and possibly, depending on how you want to live your life, because some people who don't believe in God don't want to do those things anyway. And there's usually some generally pretty good practical reasons why you shouldn't want to run around and behave in immoral ways and sleep around and things like that, because it's going to harm your life in the here and now, regardless of what's going to happen in eternity. Which is part of the reason why many people who don't believe in God still do behave morally, because there's often very good practical reasons why you should behave morally. So what have you lost if you believe in God and it turns out that you're wrong? Well, according to Pascal, not much. The only thing you've really lost is kind of the smug satisfaction of knowing that you're right, and maybe a few of those pleasures which maybe you won't even do anyway. So, he says, looking at risk versus reward, you should believe in God even if you don't know for sure that he's there, because your potential reward is so much greater than the risk you're taking. The upside is so much higher than the downside that in the absence of evidence to pick one or the other, you should just go with the upside. And that's the basis of Pascal's wager. That's really all it is. There's a lot more complicated ways people can get into it, assessing probability theory. I think people who even use Bayes' theorem on it. But you don't really have to get into all that. That's what it is he's saying, in the absence of other reasons, in the absence of anything else, if the upside is significantly greater than the downside, take the upside. And there's been, of course, been some criticism of this before. It does assume that you can't know which option is true unless you have to make a guess based on risk versus reward. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think there's very good evidence to think Christ rose from the dead, as I've argued. I think several of the arguments for God's existence are strong and work very, very well. So I don't think that's the case at all. Pascal's wager can only work in the sense of you don't know exactly which option to take, so then balance risk versus reward. Now, a philosopher named Stephen Schwartz has actually written what I would call a better variant of Pascal's wager. I actually stumbled across this in graduate school because one of the, I think it was the ethics professor, had either met him or in some way been in contact with him and used his essay, which I think is about 30 years old now, talking about Pascal's wager. And I actually used it in one of the very first essays I presented at a conference. I wrote to Dr. Schwartz and said, hey, I'd like to use your essay. Could you send me a copy? And I did. And so what Schwartz argues is that Pascal's wager, as he formulates it, is incomplete rather than defective. There's a way to make it better. Schwartz breaks his version up into 4 different levels, and for each level there are 2 key points. First, there are what he terms the faith diagonals. These diagonals are the positions where what people believe about God is wrong. So as I said, they either believe that God exists and he does not, or they believe that he does exist and he doesn't, or they seek after God when he doesn't exist, or they don't seek after God when he does exist, etc., etc. Now, Schwartz's second point is what he terms the non parallelism, which he suggests is the, quote, real essence of Pascal's wager. It is, I submit, a profound insight into a truth of the greatest importance, namely, that terrible as it would be to believe God is when he is not, it is incomparably worse to not believe he exists when he does exist. It is tragic if God doesn't exist and you believe in him, but Schwartz argues it's worse to not believe in God if he exists, as missing out on a God of love is a much greater tragedy than simply being wrong. So the relevant point here is the second level of Schwartz's wager, as opposed to Pascal's wager. He splits it up into 4 possibilities. 1, God exists and you seek him. 2, God exists and you don't seek him. 3, God exists and you seek him. And 4, God doesn't exist and you don't seek him. Now, options 1 and 4 are relatively uninteresting. It's where you're right, and it's uninteresting for assessing risk versus reward for the wager. So what about 2 and 3, where you're wrong? These options are what Schwartz terms the faith diagonals, where he argues that the non-parallelism comes in. What he argues is that option 2 will always be worse than option 3. He says, quote, it is objectively better to err in one direction than in the other, because not believing when God is means the failure to give the value response due to God as infinite goodness. Goodness with a capital G there. And now the clincher that I think makes Schwartz's variant even better is that he argues what the wager should do is compel you to investigate God further. So after hearing the wager, what you should do is not go out and say, I believe. You should go out and do what you can do to see if the claim that God exists is true. You should go out and start studying this. You should go talk to people who believe. You should go read the appropriate scriptures, the appropriate philosophical works, and so on and so forth. You should investigate the claim. So by splitting the wager up like this, what Schwartz has done is he's allowed the wager a little bit more of a modest function of demonstrating that it is always in our interest to find out if there really is a God of love. And so the wager actually invites people to come and learn more by explaining that it's in their own best interest to do so, as opposed to compelling belief. Now, most of the criticism you're going to hear of Pascal's wager is that it shouldn't compel belief. That's not a very good rational way to live. But see, that actually misses the whole point of the wager that I think Schwartz brought out very well, is the wager only works if there is no other reason why you could make a decision. In the absence of all other reasons, you need to make a risk assessment and go with the upside versus the downside. And that's what the wager is saying there. Pascal just kind of assumes, as I said, a type of agnosticism as far as regards the evidence and reasons. And what Schwartz does there is he undoes that a little bit and says, no, let's just consider the wager practically. If you find something about this compelling, the idea that it's always better to err one way or the other, this shouldn't compel your belief. It should compel you practically to go out and start researching and looking at and trying to explore, well, is there really a God of love here? So the wager is much more of an inductive or practical argument about how you should act, what you should do. In Schwartz's case, go out and learn more. In the original Pascalian case, what you should believe in the absence of other things, or reasons or evidence. Now, the other criticism that's often leveled against Pascal's wager is that it simplifies things to only two options, and the real world seems to be far more complicated than just two options. I mean, there's a whole lot more religions, belief systems, and ideas about the afterlife and the metaphysical nature of reality than just two, God is and is not. There's various variants on the idea of who and what God is. There's various types of religions that seem to have some divine thing without any kind of God with a capital G. There's Buddhism, which is in some senses kind of an atheistic religion, which still seems to believe in the supernatural, depending on which variant of Buddhism you go with. So their argument there is, maybe you could make it work in this very, very simplified sense where there's only God is or God is not. But the real world isn't like that. There's a whole lot more options. And I think there's kind of a point there, but the reality is most of us do actually think of things in binary opposition all the time. Further, most people would prima facie consider lots of religions and beliefs to just be ruled out from the start for a whole host of reasons. Again, I'll use myself as an example. I'm probably almost never going to consider something like animism, ancestor worship, or the religion of ancient Egypt as viable candidates for belief, for a whole host of reasons that I don't even feel like I need to get into here. They just don't even seem like a viable possibility to me. And likewise, for somebody who's an intelligent person who's seriously considering these things, they're not going to turn around and start considering, well, what if the Greek pantheon is true? What if the Egyptians were right? What if Norse mythology is true? And so on and so on and so on. And there's going to be very many things that they all rule out right from the start. And generally speaking, you're going to be left with some variant of Eastern religion, some variant of Islam, Christianity, or Judaism, or some type of atheism, or some variant therein. That's usually the big options that people actually would consider, which on the grand scheme of it is only like 4 or 5 options. Most intelligent people just aren't going to see 30 or 40 different viable options when they're trying to consider what they should believe about religion, the supernatural, the afterlife, God, and so on and so forth. They're going to see a couple, probably 2 or 4 at most. And further, I think you could then turn around and take the wager individually at each one. So you could be like, well, what's the upside if Buddhism is true? What's the downside if Buddhism is true? What's the upside if Christ really rose from the dead? What's the downside if he didn't? And kind of run it individually there and compare them. It's more complicated, but you could make that work if you had to. But I also think you should really bring in all the other evidence, reasons, and arguments and consider it that way. So the point of doing all this now is not just to explain Pascal's wager to you, but it's also to try to get you thinking in risk versus reward when maybe you don't really know all the available data. So let's apply that to the Chrono Virus then. Well, it's a virus that seems to be spreading. You read the news reports. Some people are claiming it's the worst thing ever. Other people are claiming, oh, it's nothing, it's a media hype trying to downplay President Trump. Or, for example, Francis Collins, who's the director of the National Institutes of Health, he was quoted a while back in The Atlantic saying, there are estimates that if nothing goes right, and if we fail to flatten the curve, and if health systems are overwhelmed, we might see the deaths of as many as 1.5 million people in the United States. No small thing, that'd be pretty horrific. So right from the start, push out all the evidence and reasons we have, and just consider the upside and the downside. Well, if it is the case that we do all this social isolation and things along these lines, and it's correct that this virus is potentially going to kill 1.5 million people, and we do this and we're right, well, we've saved lives. Probably not 1.5 million lives, because people are still going to die, but probably well over 1 million. Maybe like 1.4 million lives have been saved. That's a high upside. Now, what's the downside if we do this and it turns out we're overreacting and we're wrong? Well, the biggest downside I can imagine is we've trashed the economy and it might push the country and much of the world into a severe recession or a depression. Now, that'll probably lead to suffering and death. Hard to say for sure, but it's doubtful another, like a big recession or depression would lead to 1.4 million deaths in the U.S., but it would lead to some deaths and some suffering. And now consider again the reverse. Let's suppose we don't do all this social isolation, we go on with our business as usual. Well, if we're right, what's the upside? Well, we haven't trashed the economy, we haven't pushed ourselves into a recession or depression, our lives pretty much go on as normal, and some people get sick and some people die, but probably, if we're wrong, a comparable amount to what happens with, say, the flu or other diseases every year that don't really seem to have a greater effect on society. Okay. Now, what happens if we do that and we don't do any of the socialization and we're wrong? We should have done that. Well, then it's a disaster. 1.5 million people die, possibly more. And not only that, but you probably do wind up with an economic recession or depression as 1.5 million people, give or take, are pulled out of the workforce. There's all kinds of medical bills, and the hospital system is overwhelmed. So you're probably going to get a recession or depression there as well. So now you look at the upside versus the downside. Obviously, it would be really, really, really cool. Best case scenario you can see there is we don't do the social isolation, and it turns out the people who were saying we need to were wrong, and everything's just fine. So, okay, that'd be great. Now, in the other options, as far as where we're wrong, I would say the best option clearly is we do the social isolation, and it turns out that we didn't need to do it because we wind up with a recession or a depression. But the other way, where we didn't do the social isolation and we're wrong, we really needed to, you wind up with a lot of people dying, maybe 1.5 million in the U.S., according to Francis Collins, and you're almost certainly going to get a recession or depression on top of that. So at least if you do the social isolation and you don't need to, you only get the recession or the depression, not 1.5 million people dying and that. And so that's how the risk versus reward works there. Consider the upside versus the downside. Now, naturally speaking, you then should bring in evidence and reasons and try and figure out, well, is this something that could actually do this kind of damage, kill this many people? Because if there isn't good cause to think that there is, then don't do the social isolation. Go with that best of all cases option there. But it does seem to me that there is some pretty good reason to think that this could actually do some pretty severe damage. When you have Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health, saying this could potentially kill 1.5 million people, well, he's a pretty well-educated guy. He ran the Human Genome Project. He probably knows what he's talking about, and he could be wrong, but we should take him seriously. That's evidence in favor of the idea that this could be a very severe plague that we need to take seriously. Now, and I have seen that there are a lot of people who aren't taking this seriously, certainly on social media, and I think part of the problem here is that human beings generally don't understand how exponential growth works because it's not something we tend to see in our regular lives. But in the case of the coronavirus, from what I'm seeing people talking about, it has exponential growth, where if you don't do anything, the amount of people it's infected doubles like every 3 to 5 days. And so for the first week or two, it doesn't really seem like it's that big a deal, because you start with 2 people, then in 3 or 5 days you get 4, then in 3 or 5 days more you get 8, and so on and so on and so forth. The problem is, at a certain point, the numbers run away and you can't do anything about it. And that's how exponential growth works and why it's a problem, because eventually you're going to get 2,000 doubling to 4,000, 4,000 doubling to 8, 8 to 16, 16 to 32, 32 to 64, 64 to 128,000, up to 256,000, and so on and so on and so forth, where it quickly spirals out of control if you don't tamp it down right when there's only dozens of people or less. And that's how exponential growth works. So part of the problem, I think, here as to why people don't see reason to take this seriously is, as I said, they just don't understand how exponential growth works. A disease that works with exponential growth, if you handle it properly, it'll always look like you overreacted to people who aren't educated well and don't have all the knowledge on this subject, because it's never going to seem like a problem, where by the time it actually seems like it's a problem, it's too late to do anything about it because of that exponential growth factor. By the time you have 256,000 people who are infected with the virus, it's almost impossible to do anything about it, because then it's spreading so quickly. You have to attack something that has an exponential growth very quickly if you want to shut it down. That's also one of the reasons why, if I ever can find a savings account that gives me exponential growth and interest, I'm going to take it right away. But that's also the reason why no rational bank or financial institution will ever give me that, because it's going to get out of control and they're going to owe me tons of money really, really quickly. Maybe not for the first couple of days, or depending on how they do it the first couple of years, but eventually it's just going to go so quickly that they won't be able to keep up. And that's the problem with a virus like this that is so incredibly transmissible. And the reason why it's so incredibly transmissible and does this is because it has an incubation period of, I think, like 5 to 7 days where it's then transmittable to people. So you can go around for 5 to 7 days and not even know you're sick and be giving it to people. And apparently there are a significant amount of the people who get very mild to no symptoms, who are completely asymptomatic, who think they've got a cold or a mild case of the flu, who are spreading it everywhere because they don't even know they need to stop it and quarantine themselves. And that's why this virus spreads literally like wildfire. And that's why the only way China was able to stop it was by extreme draconian measures, where essentially nobody I think it was, they locked down, I forget the exact amount, but it was something like 90 or 100 million people couldn't even basically leave their homes for the better part of 2 months. And that's the only way China really stopped it, is by doing that. Just complete social isolation, even more so than we're being told we need to do here in the U.S. now. And further, the evidence seems to indicate that the death rate of this virus is somewhere between like 0.9% and 7-something%. It's the last best data I've got available right now is that right now it's at 7-something% in Italy, and it was at like 0.9% in South Korea, and it was at like 2% something in China. And what that means is that's the amount of people who get the virus who are dying. And there's a whole host of reasons why it might be so small in South Korea and so high in Italy. But the point is, that's much, much higher than the flu and other things that people are comparing it to. The flu is something like 0.1%. So even in South Korea, it's 9 times more deadly than the flu. And further, a lot of people who survive, about 20% of them, it seems, get complications where they need to go to the hospital. And when you have that many people with a virus, 20% of them going to the hospital, needing to be incubated, put on breathing machines and things like that, there aren't the medical resources to do that. And that's why you have people like Francis Collins talking about flattening the curve, trying to find a way to keep the number of people who would be needing ventilators and things like that down so that the medical system can deal with that. Because right now it would not be able to deal with that if the virus just spread like wildfire to everybody. So the death rate would probably be actually much, much higher than somewhere between 0.9 and 2%, because the medical system wouldn't be able to intervene for those 20% of people or so who get complications. Now, obviously, the data on all this is in a lot of flux. Nobody really knows exactly how many people have this virus or how deadly it is. All we can really say for certain based on the data coming in is that it almost certainly is much more deadly than the flu. It almost certainly is a whole lot more infectious, a lot more transmissible than the flu. And it almost certainly is the case that there are a whole lot more people infected than what is being reported in the news. Because what's being reported in the news per country is just the confirmed cases. And the confirmed cases only mean those people who've been tested for the virus and it comes back that affirmative. Which, because of how this virus spreads, its incubation period, and the fact that there are people who are asymptomatic or have minor symptoms, the number is almost certainly much higher than the confirmed cases. Nobody really knows how much higher. I've heard estimates from anywhere from like 10 times higher to 100 times higher from people who are doctors who seem to know what they're talking about. So nobody really knows exactly how much higher, but it is higher. And so in this case, I think we've got some pretty good evidence and reasons to say, well, the best case scenario, if we apply a risk versus reward wager to this, that is, we don't social isolate and it turns out to be nothing, that's almost certainly false. This is something that should be taken seriously. Now, there are other people who are way, way overreacting to the evidence and claiming that it's going to be like an apocalyptic scenario where like something like the Black Plague in Europe that killed a third of the population. I forget exactly the dates when that happened, but that was pretty horrific. But the reality is, it's almost certainly not going to be an apocalyptic scenario that's like a species-ending, extinction-level event, or even a society-ending level event. It'll almost certainly change some aspects of the society, but even if we don't flatten the curve, as Francis Collins suggests, and 1.5 million people die, is that going to end U.S. society? Is that going to end the federal government? Is that going to mean that the lights are going to go off and we're not going to have power and we're not going to have drinking water? Well, no. It'd be very, very horrific. It'd be very, very bad, and we should try and avoid that. But it's not going to lead to a Mad Max-style scenario where society is completely collapsed. That's certainly not the case either. And of course, much of what I just said there is very dependent on the data that I've seen that's being reported by various sources and me taking the experts who've talked about this seriously. And everyone does agree that to some extent that data is kind of in flux because there's a lot of unknowns about this. So maybe the unknowns come in and there's a much lesser chance that the virus infects that many people and kills that many people, and this should be downplayed a little more. Or maybe it comes in and it's higher. But it does seem very clear to me, based on what I've seen, that it's definitely within a certain range where we need to take this seriously, because that best of all cases option where we don't social isolate and it turns out we didn't need to is just almost certainly false from what I'm seeing in the data coming in. And if after all this is done, it turns out I was wrong about that and that was the best option, I'll be glad to admit that and take my licks. Because as appealing back to the wager there, comparing the upside versus the downside, the most rational option is we social isolate, because whether or not we're right or wrong, the risk involved with that is significantly less than the risk involved with not social isolating, and it turns out we were wrong and we really needed to do that. Okay, so this is taking a bit more time than I thought it would, so I'll try and blow through the trolley problem, well, quickly, but in an appropriate way that's still informative here. So as I'd mentioned before, the trolley problem was first proposed by Philippa Foot in 1967, and lots of philosophers have talked about it since then. It's a thought experiment in ethics that's the point of which is to get you to figure out what you should do in an ethical scenario, and there's some variants of it, but the classical one is this. There's a street trolley going down a track, and you're standing at a switch where you can decide which track it's going to go on. The track's going to split into two, and you decide is it going to go with A or B. On the A track, there are 5 people who can't move, who can't get out of the way, depending on which version of this story you like. They're tied up there, there are workers who can't get out of the way in time, whatever. There's 5 people there who can't get out of the way in time, so if you make the trolley go on A track, you're going to kill 5 people. On B track, there's 1 person who can't get out of the way for whatever reason, so if you make it go on B track, you're going to kill 1 person. And usually they complicate this even a little bit more by saying, hey, if you do nothing, it's going to go on A track, because similar to Pascal, the trolley's engaged, you can't stop it. It's already embarked. So if you pull the lever, then you can put it on B track where it'll kill 1 person instead of 5. Now, what are you going to do? And there are some other variants of this that pop up, like people will say, well, what if the 1 person is your family member? What if it's your wife or husband? Would you pull it then? Generally speaking, the answer most people give before it's their wife or their husband is they're going to pull the lever because they're thinking it's better to kill 1 person than 5 if you have no choice of the matter. If there's nothing else you can do, people are going to die no matter what. It's better that 5 people live. Now, there are also some variants of this where, say you're standing on a bridge, you see that the trolley is on its way on the track going to kill 5 people or whatever, and there's a fat man on the bridge. You could push him off directly onto the tracks. The trolley will hit him, stop, and only kill this fat man, and then the 5 people will live. Well, when you do that, people are a lot more hesitant to push the fat man off to kill him to save the 5 people. There's something about the idea of actually physically killing the person that way, as opposed to just pulling a lever, that makes people a bit more averse to that, which is probably a good thing. And there's a similar variant to this that was proposed by Judith Thompson, where a surgeon has 5 patients, each one is in need of a different organ, and he's got 1 healthy patient. And now there are no organs available, so should the surgeon kill the healthy patient to harvest his organs so that the 5 other patients can live? Because if they get those organs, they're going to live. Well, most of us would definitely want to say no, but ethically speaking, it's pretty similar to the trolley problem, which is, should 1 person die that 5 may live, or should 5 die that 1 may live? Now, most medical doctors would say, well, I can't do that option anyway because I took an oath, and the first part of my oath is, first, do no harm. I cannot harm 1 person to save 5 people. And that's a good response because there's a little bit of a difference in the transplant versus the trolley problem, which is in the trolley problem, you have to do something. The trolley's already moving. In the surgeon's case, he doesn't necessarily have to do something. It's not the case that he has to do something or that one person will die. And that gets into a little bit of the difference between the two variants there, which is in the trolley problem, there's a bit more impetus, a bit more oomph to make you move because the trolley's moving down the tracks, where in the surgeon's problem, he would actually have to physically kill the guy and harvest his organs, which seems in many senses to be quite a bit different than just pulling a lever to decide which way the train will go. So those are some variants of the problem. If you want to look more in depth in it, you can definitely read about it. That show I really like called The Good Place did a whole episode on this. I think you can find it on Netflix. It was in Season 2, Episode 5, where, because they're in the afterlife, they did like a simulation where they're actually on the trolley riding down it, and the one character is encouraging the philosopher, okay, you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision right now. And the guy continually fails to make a decision. Because the point of this is, it's a hard call to make. The point of this isn't that you can find an easy solution to it. The point of it is, it's a hard decision to make. How do you weigh the life of one person versus 5? That's a very, very difficult question to make. Question to answer. And so if you haven't been following the news coming out of Italy, you might be kind of wondering, well, why am I bringing up the trolley problem? The reason I'm bringing it up is the trolley problem is what's happening in Italy right now, and it's pretty likely one of the reasons why the death rate there from the coronavirus is at like 7% or so. It's because there the medical system has been overwhelmed to the point that the medical staff, the doctors, and other medical professionals are essentially having to make trolley problem-like choices. They're having to decide, do I take this person off a ventilator and put the ventilator on this person? Because they don't have enough equipment, enough resources. And so they're being forced to make calls along these lines. So they're being forced to consider things like, well, this old person who's got the coronavirus who's almost 80, I put them on a ventilator yesterday, and I'm probably going to have to keep them on a ventilator for the next 2 or 3 weeks for them to pull through. I got this younger person who's only 30 and generally speaking pretty healthy who came in who needs a ventilator. There's a pretty good chance that the old person this young person would only need the ventilator for a week. So maybe if I pull it off the old person and let them die, I can save a few more people by putting it on this younger 30-year-old person because they're only going to need it for less time. And likewise, the 30-year-old person probably has a much longer life ahead of them than the 80-year-old person. And so they're having to consider all these things because their medical system is horrifically overwhelmed. Let me just, there's a clip I found a couple of days ago of a guy reading an email he got from a medical professional in Italy that illustrates this well. So I'm going to try and find that clip and play it for you here.
This is from a nurse in Italy. We are running out of time. There is not enough beds to admit more sick people. We're also running out of personal protective equipment, and we have to reuse it. And very often the available personal protective equipment is not suitable and doesn't fully protect us. We are in constant danger. We are aware we could be infected at any time and also bring the virus in our homes and infect our loved ones. Work is so exhausting and demanding that there is no even time to cry. Only at the end of an endless shift, completely depleted of any strength, we allow ourselves to cry. We witness continuous death, but no funerals can be held, and people only grieve isolated and locked in. We are worn out, exhausted, and small in number. In the hospitals and on the ground among the population, we reach people's homes like soldiers at the front without protection. In a region where the health assistance requires far too many to be fulfilled. So there's more health demand than ability to fulfill the health demand. Now this nurse is saying we are alone. If we don't stop this avalanche, we will pay the highest toll. The failure of our civilized system and anything for which life has meaning. We are in desperate need of hospitals, nurses, doctors right now. Not tomorrow, we need qualified personnel, not improvised young people thrown at the front like soldiers. Dear citizens, We also need you. Lock yourselves in. Any time that you go outside, you open the door to the virus. We can't afford this anymore. Time is up. That's from a clearly emotional and exhausted healthcare worker in northern Italy.
So that's from a video on Dr. John Campbell's YouTube channel, which is named the same, Dr. John Campbell. He's a former nurse who has a PhD in nursing and has been following a lot of the data and details about the pandemic. And generally speaking, he seems to be giving some pretty good information. And that's an email somebody from Italy sent him saying, this is how overwhelmed we are. And that one actually, the email he read there actually paints a much more positive light on it than many other things I've seen. There was an article in the New York Times back on the 12th of March, so that's about 7-8 days ago now, that said that they're catastrophic and essentially, and I'm quoting from the article here, in a context of grave shortage of health resources, the guidelines say intensive care should be given to patients with the best chance of success and those with the best hope of life should be prioritized, i.e. they're giving out guidelines to the medical professionals. They're now saying, here's how you're going to deal with the trolley problem. Give the resources to the people who have the best chance of success, and as terrific and awful as it is, you're going to have to let the people who are 85 and likely to die because there aren't enough resources to go around. The guidelines also say that in the interest of maximizing the benefits for the largest number, limits should be put on intensive care units to reserve scarce resources for those who have, first, greater likelihood of survival, and secondly, those who have more potential years of life. And this is another quote from the article. No one is getting kicked out, but we're offering a criteria of priority, one of the doctors there said. These choices are made in normal times, but what's not normal is that you have to assist 600 people all at once. And so what he's talking about there is medical triage, which that normally does happen. It's where the doctors and people assess, well, who takes priority here? Does the person, when you go to the ER, does the person who has a limb missing take priority over the person who says they have a migraine headache? Well, obviously, if you have a limb separated from your body, you take priority over somebody who has a migraine headache, like me. I get migraine headaches sometimes. And I would be able to recognize, even having a headache in the ER, that somebody who had their limb separated from their body needs priority over me because that's life-threatening where my headache is not. The trouble they're running into in Italy is that they're now having to do triage on people who all have a life-threatening illness, who all need immediate help, and they're having to find some way to figure out who they're going to give the resources to because there are not enough resources. It essentially is the trolley problem, which is why if you've been following this news or looking on social media, you've probably seen a bunch of philosophers getting really excited saying, see, our degree actually does matter. See, you people should have listened to us. We've studied the trolley problem for years. We know how to address this. But if you read, there was an article like that in The Atlantic a while back. But if you read that a little deeper and look more at what they're saying, you'll also see that they don't have a solution because there really isn't a solution to the trolley problem. The point of this problem isn't that you can think through a solution and go, I know how I'm going to save the one person and the 5 people. Because the point is, there is no way you can do that. So what are you going to do? Now, in that show I Like the Good Place, there was a later episode after they dealt with the trolley problem where one of the characters said to one of the other ones, I figured out how to solve the trolley problem. And his solution was, you sacrifice yourself. And in the context of the show, he was sacrificing himself for the rest of the group. And he said, that's the solution. When there's no way out, when you've got the trolley problem, you sacrifice yourself. So going back to Philippa Foot's example, you don't pull the lever and you don't push the fat man down. You throw yourself in front of the trolley. Because if you know that's actually going to stop it, then you have saved all 6 lives at the expense of your own. But that's a very, very noble and good thing if you do that. That's something that is very commendable and we should all praise you for. And I genuinely hope that if I was in that circumstance, I would make that judgment call. And so, does that really help out the doctors and nurses and other medical professionals in Italy? Well, no, not really, because they already are doing that. They're putting their own lives at risk by being around such a highly infectious disease that's killing 7% of the people it infects in their country and treating all these people. that doesn't really help them make that decision because they actually are being sacrificial like that. And so are the doctors and medical professionals in this country, like my wife. I mentioned earlier that she's still going to work every day, even when there's a very high probability that she's already been exposed to the coronavirus, because that's the right thing to do. She's putting her own health at risk for those of her patients, and we should all be applauding her and every other doctor and medical professional who's doing this every day, because so many of them are. So are there some circumstances where sacrificing yourself solves the trolley problem? Yeah, I probably. But is it going to help in this case? Well, no, because people already are sacrificing themselves. So, tying this all back around, what we want to do and what we need to do to avoid this getting into where medical professionals have to decide, am I going to ventilate and put the 85-year-old on the breathing apparatus, or am I going to put the 35-year-old on there? And how am I going to make that kind of a judgment call? We want to avoid getting our medical system, into the trolley problem that Italy's now experiencing, so the death rate in this country doesn't rise as high as 7% of the people who get the virus. And the way we go about avoiding that is, well, start practicing social isolation. That's the way we can actually take the trolley problem to heart here is, let's sacrifice our own social lives, our time, our efforts, and our desires, stay inside, keep the virus from spreading, and then perhaps our doctors and other medical professionals won't have to decide whether they're going to pull the lever and kill 5 people or 1. So if we can sacrifice ourselves that way, maybe we won't have to put them in that awful position since they're already making sacrifices anyway. And so that's what I was thinking about this past week or two as all this started to go on and we got shoved in quarantine. This actually turned out to be a fairly lengthy podcast, much more than I thought it would be. I originally thought it'd only be about 30, maybe 45 minutes, but it seems like I've managed to go just a bit over an hour. Last thing I will say before I get off here is that, as I've mentioned a couple times here and before on the podcast, my wife is a doctor and she's following the medical news that's coming out about this. And again, there's a whole lot of uncertainty. But one thing that is coming out is part of the reason why, it seems anyway, part of the reason why coronavirus is so deadly to old people and not to young people is that part of what's happening is the immune system is overreacting to the presence of the virus. And for whatever reason, in young people it doesn't do that. In old people it really does, because their immune system's older and has had more time to learn. Because generally speaking, when the immune system reacts strongly, that's a good thing, but in this case it's not. And so what my wife told me, and we're doing this now, is there is apparently some research or data that strongly suggests that, or well, maybe not strongly, but suggests that taking vitamin D can actually offset some of that effects of the immune system overreacting. So both her and I are taking, I think, forget what the measurement is, but 4,000 units of the measurement of vitamin D every day, and I'm giving about 1,000 to our kids. And so you can find the research on that yourself if you want to look into it, but I'd recommend you start doing the same. And you do need to be careful not to overdose, because vitamin D is a vitamin that you can actually overdose on. So make sure you're taking a reasonable dosage. I want to give you that caution. But I figured, since I know this is a philosophy show and not a medical show, but since my wife's a doctor and we've got an ongoing crisis here and she's got us doing that, I'll pass that information off to people who listen to this, and hopefully that can help you out too. And if it comes out later that that's in some sense wrong and we stop doing that, I'll make sure to mention that on here too. Okay, so that's this week's show. I hope you learned a lot about both Pascal's wager and the trolley problem, and how it really does seem to me that they're very, very relevant to the situation we're now finding ourselves in this country and in the world. And I know I kind of mock the philosophers who are writing on social media, hey, see, you should have listened to us before. But in some senses, they're right. If people had been trained to think properly about risk and reward and ethical dilemmas beforehand, then we'd probably be able to better react to this now, and there'd be less of a chance of this becoming a huge problem, because it still could become a very huge problem. Nobody knows for sure, because everyone's saying we're still on the upswing of the curve, so to speak. But as I'm recording this, there's about 14,200 cases of confirmed cases of the virus in the U.S., and if I recall correctly, way back on Monday, there was only about 2,000. So you're seeing that exponential growth kicking in, and if we can't stop that, it probably will get out of control, because that's how exponential growth works. So, since everybody's stuck at home with not much to do, why don't you write in and let me know what you thought about the podcast? Do you think, as I do, that Pascal's wager and the trolley problem are very applicable to what's going on here, and you all should have learned about those in high school so you could think better about this and better react to what's going on? If you don't, write in and let me know why. If you do, write in and say, hooray, thanks, good for you, Phil. Write in and let me know of any other suggestions you've got for shows or things you want in the future. You can always reach me for any kind of comment at the Examined Life with Phil at gmail.com, and you can leave comments or send messages to the Facebook group, The Examined Life with Phil. Just type it in for Facebook. I haven't been very active there on that in the past couple of weeks because prior to this whole thing happening, my family was going through several rounds of sickness, which fortunately were not the coronavirus, but were like the flu and hand, foot, and mouth and things like that, and it kept me busy. And now my excuse for not updating as much is my kids are making things crazy. But I'll attempt to get back on there and start posting things more regularly, especially since so many of us all are stuck at home with not much to do. So that's what I've got for this week. Thanks for listening. I hope you all stay safe and healthy, and I'll be back with something else next week.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.